evening, everybody. Julie Evans, Executive Director of Roots and Roads Community Hospice Foundation. So glad that you can join us. We're coming towards the end of our 2022 Mortal Curiosity educational series. I'm really excited to have Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor with us tonight. I'm just going to go over the tools on our Zoom, and then David's going to take it away and MC tonight's session. So we are in Zoom meetings. As you can see here, everybody right now, your microphone is disabled. I will change that permission when we come to the Q&A session. If you're willing to share your lovely face, you can click on this little icon of the camera. If you have any technical issues, or maybe you don't want to, a question pops in your head and you don't want to forget, feel free to put it right here in this chat box and we will refer to it because I know for me anyhow, 45 minutes is a long time to hang on to one thought. And then up here in the right-hand corner, you can change the view. If you want to just see the speaker, then click on speaker view. If you want to see everybody who's in the room, hit gallery view. So those are the different options. And I will now turn it over to Mr. David Fife, my amazing colleague. David.
Thanks so much, Julie. Welcome, everybody. It's so great to have you all back and to see some new faces as well. If you haven't been with us before, we wanted to tell you a little bit about Roots and Roads Community Hospice Foundation. It's our vision to transform the end-of-life experience into the final act of living well. And we focus on three areas to realize that vision. One is through providing financial support to hospice patients and their loved ones when they can't make ends meet. So things that aren't covered by insurance. If we partner with hospice agencies throughout the area, and when they identify a need, say it's caregiving needs or rental assistance, or it could be paying for a utility bill. There's lots of needs, as you can imagine, as someone is on hospice, and oftentimes their income is greatly diminished in that of their family as they need to be able to provide care. And so we are grateful to be able to partner with some agencies to be able to provide that extra layer of support and bring the respect and dignity that everyone deserves as they're receiving that care. Another area of focus for us is what we're doing tonight, providing education throughout the community on end-of-life issues. And we have, as Julie said, a year-long series and on many different topics. And I'm so grateful that people are able to avail themselves of these opportunities. But we also have some other sessions and events that will also be in the community. And so I encourage you to just check out our website from time to time and make sure you're not missing anything. And we'll talk about some of those a little bit later in this evening as well. And then we also provide some support for research around end-of-life care. And that's really part of our partnership with hospice agencies. So if you want to go ahead. And this gives you just a little bit of an idea of what we've been doing so far in the first half of this year and providing support. One of the things that we are able to help with is provide bereavement support materials to hospice agencies. As one of the components of the Medicare benefit, hospice agencies need to be able to provide bereavement support throughout the community, not just for folks who were cared for by their agency, but anyone can avail themselves of those support groups and individual bereavement counseling. And so we like to be able to provide some support and assistance in those efforts. And you can kind of see some of the other areas that we've been focused on. We really feel like it's important to make 5 Wishes, which is an advanced care planning document, available to the community, and we do that free of charge. We provide them to doctors' offices and clinics, but then also individuals when they reach out to us as well. All right. So now we get to focus on Mary Frances O'Connor, and who just published a book, The Grieving Brain. I've read it a couple times and got so much out of it, and I'm looking forward to hearing everything that she has to say tonight and share with us. As you can see from her bio, she's an associate professor of psychology at the U of A, where she directs the GLASS lab, and which investigates the effects of grief on the brain and the body. I'll let you read the rest of her bio, but I want to share that Mary Frances is one of the kindest people I know. She is just deeply kind and caring. And one of the ways that she shows that is that she takes her cutting edge research in her work at the university and other areas, and works hard to make sure that it's available to the non-academic community like all of us, to make sure that we're able to understand and interact with that, process it, ask questions. And we're so grateful that you take the time in these kinds of settings, Mary Frances, to be able to dialogue with us. And so I'm gonna stop talking and turn it over to you. And thank you again for being with us.
Well, thank you so much, David. That's just so generous. I am completely delighted to be here, and I'm hopeful now that you can see my screen. If that isn't possible, okay, good. I'm just delighted to be here. And, you know, it's funny, people ask me, why did you write this book? And it really is that I'm steeped in grief research every day. You know, I'm running studies, I'm reading studies that my colleagues have done, and it became really clear to me that that information just wasn't getting into the hands of people who could actually use it. And so for me, writing the book was, you know, you're having a conversation with the person next to you on the plane and they ask you what you do, and then you get into, you know, the grief research. So that's who the book is intended for. I'm also delighted that Antigone Books on 4th Avenue has been carrying the book. And if you attend this evening, you can get a signed copy if you request that from Antigone Books. I'll be signing books for those of you who order it through Antigone, which is fun for me. I have been doing this grief research for probably more than 20 years now. And people often ask me what motivated me to do grief research. And for me, it's not just about what does grief feel like, but why and how does the brain create this experience that we're having? And is there anything that we can learn from taking a neuroscience perspective on grief that might help us think about grief in a new way? Neuroscience is certainly not the only way to look at grief, and possibly not even the most helpful way to look at grief. My primary interest is that grief is the language, neuroscience is the language of our times, and I just think we need to keep talking about grief. So if neuroscience gives us a way to talk about it, then I'm all for it. But there is also a personal side, of course, to my work, and that is that when I was 13 years old, my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. And I didn't know this at the time, but she was not expected to live through the year. I did know, however, that grief came to our house, and amazingly, miraculously, she lived another 13 years. But when she died when I was 26, I just developed an ease with people who were grieving. And so, you know, it just doesn't bother me if you cry uncontrollably, you know. And so that meant that I was able to interview participants in my research studies and really understand what they were experiencing, and then try to map that on to the MRI scans or the blood tests that I was giving. And so I'm hopeful that it is some of my personal experience and the science coming together that will help you to think about why grief research might be important and how it might give us some new insights. But I like to start explaining the neurobiology of grief with a story. And for the story to work, you have to accept a premise. And the premise is that your dining room table has been stolen. It doesn't really matter why your dining room table has been stolen, but you wake up one night in the middle of the night and you're thirsty. And so you get up to go get a glass of water and you walk down the hall and it's all dark. And so you cross the dining room to go into the kitchen to get a glass of water. And just as your hip should hit where that dining room table was, you feel it. You feel that it isn't there. And that's a real sensation. You feel the absence. Well, this is actually a very difficult thing for a neuroscientist to explain. We understand what it is to have an experience in the world. We've mapped all those nerves that go through your arms and legs and up to your brain and indicate a perception, a sensation. But it's very difficult to explain why you would have a feeling when something wasn't there. And I think that the reason this analogy is so important to me is this is the experience that many grieving people are having, that their world should be full of their loved one. They should be in the room. They should be down the hall. They should be coming over for dinner. And for them, they are constantly aware of the absence of that person. And no one else is really experiencing the world in the same way. And I think that can lead to a real feeling of isolation, that you're having a different experience that they are. So after so many years of studying grief and grieving, and after thinking about it from the perspective of the brain for a long time, I think it is safe to say that you could think of grieving as a form of learning. So in one sense, learning all of those new habits, 5 o'clock comes around, your husband doesn't walk through the door. The plants that your wife was watering are now, dying unless you do something with them. All those small things that you have to learn, all those habits that have to be updated. But bigger things as well. We have to be able to understand what it means for us that this person has died. And so that can be everything from, I was going to retire with this person and I can't even imagine what retirement is going to look like now. Or my daughter has died and now I have a grandchild that I'm raising because that's simply what has to happen. But that's a whole big learning curve. So I think there are lots of ways in which grieving can be thought of as a form of learning. But what's interesting to me is it isn't a type of learning that just happens overnight. You don't just wake up and think, they're gone and now I will do things differently. That's really not how grieving works at all. And so the question that has sort of plagued me for a long time is, why does grieving take so long? Why does it take us a very long time to understand that this person isn't coming back? When I was just telling David about, I teach a class and historically I've taught that class in a big lecture room. And, you get used to which students sit where, and they always sit in the same place. And, this student talks a lot, or this student always has the answer, that sort of thing. But at the end of the semester, they all leave. And then when the new semester starts again, I never have the expectation when I come into the classroom the following semester. I never have the feeling, oh, why isn't that student still here? Right? There's nothing about that scenario that makes me think, oh, they really should be here. But many of you will have that experience when we think about the death of a loved one. And in fact, many people will say, I just feel like they're going to walk through the door again. So thinking about this, I've relied a lot on attachment theory, which is a psychology theory that helps us to understand relationships, and I think is therefore very relevant when we talk about grief. And the reason I think that it takes so long is because for your brain, your loved one is both gone and everlasting at the same time. Now, this is one of the strange and crazy things about the way the brain works. The brain has no problem believing two streams of information at the same time, even when they're incompatible. So on the one hand, you have a memory that the person has died. That might be you were at the bedside, or you got that terrible phone call, or even you were at the funeral, the memorial. You have a memory system in your brain that knows the reality and can tell you that this person has died. But on the other hand, when we bond with someone, part of that bonding is this implicit belief, very strong implicit belief, that I will always be there for you and you will always be there for me. And that's a very important belief because our loved ones are as important to our survival as food and water. So you couldn't just leave your loved one every day and go off to work or send your kids off to school if you didn't have some very deep belief that you would all reunite in the evening, that you would all come back together again. I was recently traveling with my partner in London, and, we had a plan. What if one of you gets onto the tube and the other one doesn't make it on, So we had a plan about how we would meet up. You'd find the local Starbucks, the closest Starbucks, because they have Wi-Fi, and that's how we would meet again. But it's so important to us that we reunite with our loved ones, that we spend a lot of effort and energy figuring out how that's going to happen. And it's very effective while we are in these relationships to bring us back together. The trouble is, when a loved one dies, that implicit belief that they are out there, it continues. Even though obviously those two things can't be true. On the one hand, the memory of the death, and on the other hand, the belief that they're out there, those are completely incompatible. And this is why sometimes we do things that even to ourselves feel totally crazy, like picking up the phone to call someone to tell them, and then remembering that you can't, that they've died. Or people will tell me about seeing a birthday card and thinking, oh, I'll get that because they would really, but they're not going to have another birthday. And so I think it's because these two things are both going on in the brain that grieving takes a very long time. But the way I was starting to talk about attachment, you really can't understand grief without understanding love and bonding. A wonderful researcher named Kathy Shear says, grief is the form that love takes after someone has died. And I think that's very true. It is a continuation of that relationship. And so when we think about what does it mean to fall in love, that can be falling in love with your spouse, falling in love with your baby. That bonding experience, it changes the brain. It physically gets encoded in the brain. The proteins in your brain are folded differently because you had this experience where you loved them, that special person, and they loved you, and they felt you were that special person. It changes the way the neurons fire, the patterning that they fire in. And even in animals, there's a kind of animal called a vole, and one kind of vole, the prairie vole, they mate for life. And what that means is if the vole who's fallen in love with this other vole, the animal researchers don't say falling in love, but you get the idea. once they have bonded like that, they prefer that vole over any other vole that you might put in front of them. And so what's interesting is trying to understand what's happening in that brain that's conserved even across species. And we know that these monogamous pair bonds in voles, they cause these epigenetic changes in a particular part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. And what that means is once you have formed a we, when you are separated from that other part of you, some people call it their better half, when you're separated from your better half, there is a physiological response to that separation. For example, you get decreased oxytocin binding in that nucleus accumbens brain region. You get increases in cortisol. You get increases in blood pressure. And this happens in human beings as well. And I think what I've learned from people that I've talked with about this data is many people don't realize feeling grief isn't a choice. It isn't like, oh, I should stop feeling grief. That's not really how it works. There is a physiological response because you were bonded with this person. And that is simply the natural response to being aware that this person who's so important to you is gone. Now, over time, we learn, there's that learning again, over time we may learn how to manage the fact that we have grief. We may come to find ways to comfort ourselves or to set it aside or to process it. But in terms of the actual experience of grief, that unfortunately just comes along with being human and having relationships. What's interesting is this nucleus accumbens region that we see in these little tiny rodents. It may not be so different in human beings. I've done some neuroimaging studies, and in these studies, what I do is I bring a person into our lab who has experienced the death of a loved one. And I ask them to bring with a photograph of the person who has died. In this particular picture here, that's actually a picture of my Nana that I used in this instance. And so then when people are in a neuroimaging scanner, an MRI scanner, the same kind of scanner that you would have your knee MRI'd or your head, but in this case, we're looking at what's the brain activity. We compare what the brain is doing when they're looking at this picture of a loved one for whom they're grieving, as compared to just looking at a stranger, looking at another person. And what this study showed that I had done, this was a study I was doing at UCLA when I was there, what we found was that people who were having a harder time adapting after the death of a loved one, they were showing more activity in this same nucleus accumbens region that we had seen in voles when they were bonding, and that we had seen changes when the voles were separated from their mate. Now, on the right side of the slide here, you can see there's this correlation. So on the left-hand side, we see the amount of activation in that brain region. And along the bottom, we see the amount of yearning people told me they were having for the person who had died. So more yearning is further out to the right there. And what we saw was people who were reporting more yearning for their loved one, they showed more activation in this particular brain region. The activity in the brain region wasn't correlated with their age or how long it had been since the person had died or other kinds of positive or negative feelings, but it was very specifically correlated with yearning. And we have a couple of studies that have just come out last year and now this year that are showing a replication of the same thing, that yearning seems to be correlated with this very specific part of the brain. That's a lot of data. That's sort of interesting at some level. But what I partly take away from that isn't just about the data itself, but it's the idea that our brain is forever physically shaped by our loved one. So that after they die, I'm still carrying around brain tissue that is very particular because of the relationship that we had. And because it is our brain through which we perceive the world, in many ways, all the experiences that I am having are also shaped by the fact that this person loved me and I loved them. And I just find that incredibly comforting that although they are physically no longer on this plane, I still do actually carry a piece of them that I can revisit and that I know is stamped into my cortex. Now, through this talk, you may have heard me use the term grief and use the term grieving. So in regular everyday conversation, we don't really make a distinction between those two words. But as I've been doing scientific studies, I've discovered it's really important to make that distinction. And as I've talked with more and more grieving people, I've come to discover that they also find this distinction useful. So let me tell you what I mean when I make that separation between these two words. So grief is a noun. Grief is that feeling that overwhelms you, just like being tumbled in the washing machine, you know? You feel like, oh my God, I'm not going to get through this moment. This is unbearable. And it could be, you know, a range of emotions. It can be numbness. It can be just confusion. But it's that feeling that comes and goes. Grieving, on the other hand, is the way that grief changes over time. Right? So the reason this became important in the studies I was doing was if you put someone in the scanner and you show them a photo of their loved one and you see the activity that the brain is doing, you're measuring grief, right? You're measuring the moment. But many of the questions that I had were actually about grieving. How do things change over time for people? And I came to realize that I would have to have the same person in the scanner multiple times, you know, months apart or a year apart to see what was changing. And so grieving is a verb. Grieving is the way that grief changes so that, you know, the first 100 times you have that wave of grief and you think, I'm not going to get through this. The 101st time, it can feel just as bad, but it may be more familiar. You may know, I hate this, but I am going to get through this moment. And this is part of then how we learn to build a life that is meaningful while we are a person who has grief. It doesn't have to go away in order for us to have a meaningful life. And that is part of what the learning, I think, is about. Now, to give you an idea of what that change over time might look like, this is a study that came out recently where some researchers were looking at a whole group of people and they were looking at different months. So it was the same person where they're looking at different time points after the death of a loved one. And they were asking them, what is your grief? Tell me about your grief. And so you see a severity score on that left side. And so what we see is that in the beginning, we see there's a lot of grief, right? And we see this blue line, which is that, you know, it's maybe this moderate amount of grief. And then you see this change over time. You see a decrease in the frequency and the intensity of the grief that people are experiencing. And this is what we call a resilient trajectory. This is actually the most typical trajectory when we experience the death of a loved one. This surprises a lot of people, but the most common way that we respond to the death of a loved one is we have grief, and that over time there is a change, and that is a natural process. You'll see that at the end, it's not that they don't have any grief. 0 isn't even on that, on that axis. But it is different. It is different over time. The green group, we see they're a group that starts with much higher, very severe grief. And very frequently this happens when there's an unexpected death, for example, and you just, you get the rug ripped right out from under you. And so you have this very intense, acute reaction. But there again, with that green line, you can see they also show a decrease in the frequency and intensity of their grief over time. It's a natural process. Now, the group that we worry about as clinicians and as friends and family members are those people in the red line. And what you see with the red line is there just isn't change over time. There's a severe grief and it just persists. And that line is the average. You can see sometimes they are doing better and sometimes they're doing worse than they were initially. And so this is the group. In that particular study, they called it chronic grief. The term that we tend to use now that's been accepted by the psychiatric community is prolonged grief disorder. And what that means is that over time, over months and months, this is 2 years of months. I don't know how tiny this slide is, but that's 2 years. There's just no change for these individuals. And so what I like to point out is if you look at 1 year, so that's sort of the midway in the graph. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but it would be, roundabout a little bit past here. That's when we can actually start to see these groups separate, right? So if you're talking to someone who's grieving and you're looking at people here, it's kind of hard to tell what trajectory they're on yet. Everyone's a mess in acute grief, And so as clinicians, we tend not to try and intervene or even just describe them as having prolonged grief until after a year, because then we start to feel more confident. Okay, how you're doing right now is going to predict how you're doing at 2 years. And that's the important part. We know that research on good psychotherapy that's targeted at grief, that's targeted at prolonged grief, I should say, it can help to get people back on that natural healing trajectory. That type of therapy, it's not trying to take anyone's grief away. I've said earlier, that's just not going to happen. But it does mean that hopefully by building some new skills, by having some new experiences with a supportive therapist, that they are able to get back onto a trajectory where they are seeing change over time. So the older term for prolonged grief disorder was complicated grief. And although we don't use the term complicated grief now, I still kind of like the term, and I will explain why in the hopes that it is helpful to you. I described to you that grief is the natural reaction to loss, and that there's this natural trajectory that happens. And I think of that as analogous to when you break a bone, right? When you break a bone, I broke my ankle a few years ago. It's not that I'm doing anything to knit those cells back together again, in my ankle. It's a natural process. Now, I can help that natural process in the sense of giving it support, right? So I can wear a boot and some people might wear crutches or a cast. But with that support, it's going to heal unless there are complications, right? So maybe you get an infection, or maybe there's a second break to the bone. And in those cases, it is very helpful to have someone who is well-trained to go in and sort out that complication. But sorting out that complication is still not knitting those cells back together. The point of doing that intervention is to help people so that they can get back on their own natural healing trajectory. And those healing trajectories look pretty different for different people. They take different lengths of time, they look different, and years after you have broken a bone, if you take an x-ray, you can still see that you broke a bone. The bone is working perfectly well, but you can still see that there was a break. And I think that's always been a helpful analogy to me in thinking about grieving. So what are some of these complications then that might get in the way when we're talking about people who are having a tough time adapting? And I will tell you that, social support is so important for people who are grieving. And I will also tell you, it's really hard to sit with people who are grieving. It's really, really hard to see someone suffering, especially when it's someone you love, right? Someone you really care about. And I will tell you, I have had hundreds of conversations with people who are grieving, and I still say the wrong thing. I inevitably say something and I think, oh God, why did I say that? I think we think that our job is to cheer people up, to make them feel better. And it turns out that's really not our job. Our job is to be there with them. Because you can think about it this way. If you're walking around in a world that feels different from the world everyone else is walking around in, where you're very aware of the loss, the absence of this person, then you're trying to even just make sense of what the experience is that you're having. And now if you're sitting with someone who is also expecting you to feel better, that's a lot to sort out. If you're sitting with someone who wants to know how you're feeling and will give you the attention and the time to sort of describe that, that can be very helpful. Or alternatively, the person who says, you know what, let's go try something new, right? There's something very good about trying new things when you're living in this new world after you've walked through this door of losing a loved one. So 2 of the complications that we think about that can really get in the way are avoidance and rumination. So rumination is these thoughts that just keep running through your head. And it's very typical, especially at the beginning. A guy I know in Tucson whose son died by suicide calls these the would've, should've, could've thoughts. And many of you will probably recognize them. The if only I could have gotten them to the hospital sooner, or the doctor should have run this other test, or if only they would have known that train was going to be late. We have an infinite number of stories. The human mind is amazing and can come up with an infinite number of stories. But the trouble with each of those stories is each one of them ends with, and then my loved one didn't die. But the reality is they did die. And when we spend a lot of time in these stories, we're actually not spending time in the present moment, in the way things are now, and in learning what does it mean to live in this life, which is not how I wanted it to be, but is the life that I have. And how can I learn to do meaningful things and feel a full range of emotions? Because human beings are funny, you can't just shut off the negative feelings. If you shut off the negative feelings, you shut off all feelings. And so people end up just feeling numb, like they're going through the motions. If negative feelings feel unbearable and you kind of just avoid those, it means that you're also not, engaged with your grandchild who's making silly faces, or the beautiful barista who gives you this lovely smile when you go into the coffee shop. If you're stuck in your head about how things should be, you're much less likely to also be experiencing love and pride and joy, along with grief and anger and difficult emotions. avoidance is a tough thing. I think if there was one thing that I would have people take away, it's what might you be avoiding? And that's a real heart-to-heart conversation one has to have with themselves, because usually you're avoiding because you don't want to be doing or thinking or experiencing something. So it can take a little bit of, a little bit of self-investigation to figure out what you're avoiding. It might be a conversation. It might be that you're going out of your way to drive around a place that reminds you of a loved one. It might be that you're avoiding Christmas celebrations. It could be anything. But the trouble with avoiding is it doesn't give us an opportunity to learn. By avoiding, you don't have the opportunity to learn what is life like now that I am a person who carries grief. And so let me give you a more concrete example, will probably be more helpful. Let's say you have an older couple, and let's say that the wife dies in this particular couple, and that they used to go out for dinner with their couple friends, and the husband has begun really avoiding going out to dinner with this group of friends, even though it was something they really enjoyed. He thinks, I'm not going to go. I'm going to think about her the whole time. It's going to be awkward. They're going to feel awkward. I'm going to feel awkward. So the trouble is, we don't actually know what dinner is going to be like. We think we know what dinner is going to be like. And, if you sort of work up your courage, maybe ask for some support from your friends, and you go out to dinner, it may not be great the first time. I'm not going to lie, right? You may think about her a lot, and you may be somewhat awkward. And you may think, well, why did I do that? But if you do it again, you may still think, it's just not the same. But we had a conversation about a book I hadn't heard about, and maybe I'll get that book. That sounded interesting. Right? Because you were with people in the moment and you were experiencing what is it like to be here now. And that being here now very often has wonderful things in it. And so you go out to dinner again, and it turns out you also enjoyed, the clam chowder, which you hadn't had before. So it's sort of this slow upward spiral. And it doesn't mean you're not going to have grief. But it does mean that you're going to create a meaningful world that you can want to live in, and maybe even honor the person who you loved and who loved you. And so if we sort of take seriously this perspective of the brain and the idea that grieving might be thought of as a form of learning, then maybe it changes the question that we're asking each other. Maybe it isn't just, how are you doing? But maybe the question is, what's changed for you? What are you learning? How is it different from the last time we talked? How is it different since the funeral? I want to know. I want to know how your experience is changing. I really want to thank David and Jennifer and all of my amazing graduate students that help make all this research possible, and the agencies that fund this research, and all of you for being brave and taking the time to really sort of sit down and think about these things with me together.
Thank you, Mary Frances. Thank you so much for sharing that. And we have time, folks. I think, Julie, that you're going to allow people to unmute themselves if they would like to and ask questions. And so you can just do that. And as folks prepare for that, I did notice I'll start. There was one question. Charles was wondering, is there any correlation of the evidence for a spiritual connection post-death and its alleviation of grief from this type of communication? was his question. So I don't know if you want to touch on that a little bit while
Sure.
other folks are thinking about their questions.
Yeah, sure. So, I don't do a lot of research on communication in a direct sort of way with the deceased, but I can tell you, I had a graduate student who, as her dissertation, I'm hoping this will be published this year, did a wonderful study, a daily diary study. And so what that means is each day these were people who had lost a spouse. And each day for 14 days, we'd ask them, how are you feeling today? What were the positive feelings and the negative feelings? What was your grief like today? And then we also asked them, did you feel supported by your loved one today? And we left it ambiguous. They can interpret that kind of however they want. Maybe some people interpreted it as, I imagined support. Other people felt like people were present, full range, doesn't matter. But, we asked sort of specific things. Did they give you advice today? Or did they comfort you today? That sort of thing. Well, you'll be intrigued to know that the vast majority of them did feel supported by their loved one. I actually knew this from an unpublished study, so that part I wasn't actually completely surprised about. But what was fascinating to me was, remember, we also asked them how they felt on that day. And in the first couple of years, on the day that they got the most support from their loved one, they also felt the most grief. And you can see how that would be. I mean, if you're feeling a lot of grief, maybe you're also sort of reaching out in some way to have support. But what was fascinating was after 2 years, on the days that they felt support from their loved one, they actually felt better. And I think it's just a great example of this change over time, that the very same thing can feel very different after more experience, after more learning, after more time has passed.
Thank you. Kate, did you want to go ahead and ask a question?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. O'Connor. I'm halfway through your book and I'm loving it. I'm really looking forward to this talk, so thank you. I am beginning my journey as a grief support specialist, and I was wondering, I know this is kind of tangential to your topic, but I was wondering if you might be able to point me towards some resources that discuss the physical manifestations that grievers endure. Brain fog is one thing, but I also know people who had changes in vision, they had changes in facial awareness, and I was wondering if you might be able to recommend any sources that I could dive into for that.
Yeah, boy, that is such a great question. And I will tell you, the amount of research that's actually done on it is quite small. Although I think that, so I have a lab page, which is maryfrancesoconnor.org. And I do talk about some of the physical changes, although the ones I'm talking are mostly immune and cardiovascular, not so much the sensation and cognition ones. David, I don't know if, because bereavement support certainly has a long history of helping to normalize for people that these changes happen in vision, in the way your stomach feels, and vertigo, whatever. David, do you have any good suggestions off the top of your head?
I think a lot of it is one, being able to talk about them and recognize them and name them, becoming aware of these changes, and then also being able to connect what the emotions are with that feeling. It's people oftentimes will talk about doing body scans. I'm sure that you have done that as well, Kate, and where you're holding this. But then it's also being able to say, okay, if that is that I'm not sleeping, or I have brain fog, or I can't stop eating chocolate. That it's what's going on emotionally as you feel those things coming on, and also the other side of it is what also is maybe alleviating some sensations that you're having that you don't want to, the negative ones that you. So it's a combination of those things. I don't know if that helps at all, Kate, in this process for you.
The only other thing I would add is we do know that a study a few years ago that relaxation is really important. Grieving is really stressful for your body, it turns out. And so we actually taught people progressive muscle relaxation, which is just an organized way to figure out how to relax your muscles, sort of muscle group by muscle group. And it was actually very helpful for people and didn't just help their physical state, but actually helped their grief as well. So that what you said, David, cued me into remembering that. So that's a thought.
Thank you so much. Georgia, did you want to say something?
Well, I'm looking at Jenny's chat, and I really like what she's asking. If she'd like to read that.
Sure. Is there any difference in the brain signals around grieving if the relationship with the deceased loved one was difficult and or estranged at the death? It's an excellent question. And I will tell you that, our neuroscience of grief is really in its infancy. There are so many studies that I have to say, well, that hasn't been done yet. We certainly know that these relationships, they lead to a different experience of grief. Many people experience relief when a person with whom there has been a very stressful relationship, when that person dies. And in fact, in another study, with those trajectories I was showing you, the blue and the green and the red, there's a very small proportion of people who feel more depressed before the death and actually feel better afterward. And you can imagine, right? If a spouse is alcoholic or a parent is abusive, right? And so that is a genuine experience. We don't know anything about the neurobiology at this point of that.
It just doesn't make sense what you're saying, though, to me, because, to me, if it was really toxic during, then you would go back and you would be re-examining and feeling all kinds of negative feelings and grief and guilt and what ifs, that kind of thing. So I don't understand that your answer.
You make a good point. So it is also the case that many people feel depressed after the death of a loved one when there's something about that relationship which continues on, right? So as I was saying, if my own experience with my mother was complex, and having her with me was not always a great thing, And so it took me a long time not to sort of feel her judgment, for example. And I had depression for a while as I worked through what part of that was her, what part of that was me. And so I think perhaps that's the aspect that you might be referring to. It looks like we have another hand up. Oh, it's Ginny.
It's Ginny. Did you want to follow up?
Thank you. I'll just briefly, for me, and what I try and express to anybody who, is estranged or has difficult relationships, begin the work as soon as possible, because that's what truly brought me myself, the differentiation between the difficult person. That when I learned actually that my mother had died, and I hadn't talked to her in 11 years, I felt peace. I talk about feeling something in your body. I have no regrets. I have sadness at times, it ebbs and flows, but I have a lot of memories that I pull up that I can pull up. But I just say often, don't wait till they die. Yeah. If you've got difficulties, start working on it some way. I didn't get to work on it with her, but it can be done. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you so much. This has been awesome.
Oh, thank you, Jenny.
Mary Frances, I wonder if you might talk a little bit about intrusive thoughts. I really appreciated how you conveyed a message that they're normal, and that they're our brain working to understand what's happened, but they can be overwhelming, and feel like that they're the predominant thoughts that we are having. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So we know that after a death, even empirically, we know that people have more thoughts about the loved one. And, it's funny, those intrusive thoughts, well, it sounds strange, but, we're having thoughts about our loved ones all the time, which are intrusive, right? So this is oh, my wife is having that meeting with her boss. I wonder, I'll just text her, right? Or, ooh, did my daughter remember to put that in her backpack? I'm going to have to run by the school. Or even just thinking about them. So it turns out because our loved ones are so important, we're actually having intrusive thoughts about them all the time. It's just that when they're alive, that's a normal, kind of wonderful thing. When a loved one dies, those pop-ups, they don't shut off right away. We keep having intrusive thoughts, but now that comes with the realization as well that we're not going to see them again. And so now they're very emotional when we have these intrusive thoughts. So I think that we know that intrusive thoughts are typical. We know that they are distressing. And it can be helpful to talk with people about them just so you know how typical that they are. But it is also partly allowing, this is not an empirical statement, but I think about letting those thoughts just come through you, right? They're not from you, they're coming through you. And somehow that can make them less sticky. I'm in this round and round and round. I can change my environment. I can talk with someone. This is sort of the learning process of what do I do now that I'm a person who has a lot of grief? And sometimes that grief is those thoughts. Is that where you were headed, David? Is there anything that you want to add?
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. I know that many people will talk about this and just that it'll be, some people talk about grief bursts, like I'm doing just fine. I wasn't, and then all of a sudden these thoughts will come in and it can feel as if they take over. And they do in many ways. Yeah. It can absolutely take over that moment. Yeah. But it is this process. If your brain's trying to figure out what the heck happened, and it's part of understanding that. And I love that perspective of this is learning. We are learning about life through this and love.
Yeah. And our brain has a funny way of trying to do it, and it doesn't always feel like how we wish it was happening.
So Jillian was asking, do you know if there is similar existing research findings regarding grieving for other types of losses? Other than the dining room table.
Yeah, right. Other than the random having your dining room table stolen. It's an excellent question, and I get this question frequently. So I would say that in my understanding, in my way of thinking about it, that bonded relationships, they do lead to grief in a very particular kind of neurobiological way. But of course, a relationship can be broken for other reasons than death. So a relationship can be broken up through divorce, through estrangement, even through the empty nest, right? Relationships can significantly change, and that can bring us a real feeling of grief. And I think, one of the ways that I have found it useful to think about this, remember I talked about, when you bond with someone, you make the we. And if you think about it, I use, say, for example, the word daughter to describe myself, but that word daughter actually implies two people, doesn't it? Or the word spouse implies two people. Even the word best friend implies two people, even though I'm using it to describe myself. And so I think one of the learning things that has to happen is, who the heck am I now? What does it mean to be a widow? What the heck does that mean? What does it mean to be an orphan? What do they do? And so some of it is even learning, how do I function in the world without this other person? The reason I find that useful is there are lots of ways that part of ourself can experience loss. So if you retire, you're a retired person. You're not a working person. And so what does that look like? What does that mean? And the feeling of grief or loss of hearing, for example, or all sorts of other losses, even moving. So I did a study of bereavement, romantic relationship breakup and homesickness. And it turns out those feelings of yearning are actually very similar, although the intensity does tend to be more intense when there's a death, on average, right? And so while the experience may be similar, it may be somewhat less intense. And then with situations where there can be, so in divorce, one of the challenging things is it isn't just that the person is gone, there's often a strong sense of blame or guilt. And so that's sort of on top of. Now, not that you can't have blame and guilt when a person has died, but it's even more common, right, with divorce. Yeah.
My friends, I'd like to kind of close this out a little bit by asking you, based on what you know of grief through your own research and also personal experiences, if you could still be in loving relationships but not have to experience grief, would you make that choice? Or is grief so connected to our experience of love that it would be fundamentally changed, in your opinion?
For me, I just want to say ever so quickly, because I saw it in the chat. People were like, where do I get this book? So I just wanted to say that Antigone Books, your local independent bookstore, they have it, but you can also get it online anywhere that you buy books, and it comes in hardback, it comes in ebook form, and it comes in an audiobook form as well. Okay, so having said that, I'll be honest, one of the amazing things to me about grief is that when I can stop thinking about my grief, it's my grief, and I can start thinking about the idea that there is grief, that it is a part of the human condition, that if I can make that momentary switch of perspective, it often brings me to feeling closer to people who know what I'm going through. I have walked through this door, which I would not choose to walk through, but I have walked through this door, and it turns out there's a hell of a lot of people on the other side. And so for me, deeply learning about what grief meant also connected me to people. It motivated me about what I want to do with my own, brief life and how I want to treat my loved ones. And so I don't think there's a way to be in our reality, in our human experience, without having grief and learning how to navigate that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this time. I know that we could go easily for another hour, but we're not going to keep you for another hour. Julie, did you want to share some more slides as we close this out? Mary Frances, again, thank you so much for having this conversation with us and engaging with us at this level and having us grapple with so many of these experiences that we've had from different perspectives. It helped me so much to understand the science behind what I have been hearing and experiencing for years. It opens up new possibilities, I feel. So thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you so much.
All right, folks, we're going to just briefly tell you about some upcoming things. For over a year now, we have been at Roots and Roads, we've been working on this thing called the Crosswalk. It's a resource for navigating serious illness and end-of-life care decisions. Folks had come to us and said, we don't know what the difference is between palliative and hospice care. We don't know even what first steps to take when we've been given a life-limiting diagnosis or a loved one has. How do we navigate all the caregiving decisions we have to make? And how do we find emotional and spiritual support for ourselves and our loved ones through this process? And so we put together this thing called the Crosswalk. And on the 19th of November, it's going to be kind of the coming out for us. We're going to show it to a larger part of the community at the Arizona State Museum. The Southwest Folk Life Alliance is having an exhibit there that is wonderful if you get a chance to stop by and take a look at that. But we're going to be there on the 19th to show people a little bit about this. And over the year, we're going to have it more readily available as we get more parts of it. But please know that this is coming. It's going to be a wonderful resource for the community that we can turn to, from everything from the time of diagnosis through bereavement support. So we wanted to let you know that this is coming. And in a couple of days, there is a virtual session called Companioning Pet Loss that is sponsored by us and the learning community that Mary Frances has been part of for years, and Harmony Hospice as well. Please go onto our website to register. It's this coming Saturday from 9:30 till noon. And then we hope to see everybody back next month for a session on psychedelics and end-of-life care. Mary Mangini will be with us to talk about the possible benefits of psychedelics that they can offer folks who are facing end of life and the anxiety and existential angst that they can experience, and what psychedelics might offer in terms of opening up new understandings and possibilities. Also, we will have Katya Allen, a researcher from the University of Arizona, will talk about the use of psilocybin for the treatment of obsessive compulsive disorder. So please join us next month. Thank you for being here tonight. And if you feel so moved, we would greatly appreciate any donations. It's your gifts that make events like this possible, and it makes it possible for us to support hospice patients and their loved ones when it is most needed. So you can log on to our website at any time. There's a tab up there for donations, and please do so if you feel so moved. We will put it to good use. Let me put it that way. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Thank you, Mary Frances, and we look forward to seeing everybody again very soon.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Night. Thank you.